HOA locked me out of my own lake. I bought the key, they said. You are not allowed past this gate. I asked, but why? This land has been in my family for 50 years. They laughed and pointed at a sign. HOA rules. No exceptions. Subscribe now if you believe some rules are meant to be broken, especially when they are built on greed and arrogance. Because what happened next turned their entire system upside down. I did not move to Willow Creek to start a war. I came here because my father left me a piece of peace, a lake house built by his hands, next to the very lake he taught me how to swim in. It was not much, just a quiet place outside town, where the air smelled like pine and the morning mist hovered low over the water. The kind of place that heals you, that reminds you who you are. But the first time I pulled up the gravel drive and stepped out with my duffel bag, there was a glossy white letter pinned to the gate. Access denied, HOA restriction. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some clerical error. But when I called the number listed, a woman answered with a tone sharp enough to slice stone. Sir, this lake and its surrounding roads are now under HOA oversight. Only registered residents with key cards may enter. I told her this was my father's land, that the dock he built still had his initials carved into the wood, that no one had asked me before fencing it all off. Her response was cold. If your property does not meet current HOA compliance, you no longer have access. It is private now. Enjoy the view from the outside. It was like being robbed in daylight, standing in front of my family's legacy with a gate slammed in my face. And the worst part? That lake, my lake, was still sparkling in the sun just a few feet away, unreachable, as if I had become a stranger to my own bloodline. But what the HOA did not realize was that they had just challenged the wrong man. I did not sleep that night. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, her voice, so smug, like she was guarding treasure that was not even hers. I sat on the porch of a cheap motel across town, staring at the HOA access sign they had placed right outside my property line. Residents only, violators will be prosecuted. I was not a violator. I was the rightful heir. But they had turned me into an outsider with just a laminated card and a lock. And I could not shake the feeling that this was not about rules. It was about power. The next morning, I walked into the town hall with every document I owned. My father's will, the land survey papers, the tax receipts, even faded photographs of my dad sitting on that dock with me as a boy. The clerk at the counter barely looked up. She flipped through the papers with disinterest and said, "Sir, this property falls within the newly expanded HOA perimeter. If you have issues, you will need to speak with their board." That was it. No apology. No help. Just a polite shrug into bureaucracy. So, I went to the HOA office. Clean floors, fake smiles, and glass doors that shut softly but felt like prison walls. I was greeted by a man named Mr. Thatcher, the HOA president, who wore a navy blazer and a face that had not seen sunlight in years. He listened as I explained, then leaned back and said, "We understand your emotional attachment, but your father never opted out of the new community plan. So unfortunately, your access was revoked when the boundaries changed." He smiled like it was also civilized. "But this is my lake, my dock, my home," I said quietly, barely holding back the anger boiling in my chest. He tapped his pen on a thick binder and said, "You are welcome to reapply for access. There is a process, a fee, and of course, compliance inspections. But that could take months." Something in me snapped. Not in rage, but in clarity. They thought they had control. Because of paper. Because of process. Because of privilege. They had forgotten something. I had not come to ask permission. I had come to reclaim what was already mine. And I had just figured out how. I drove back to my father's lake house in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road twisted through tall pine trees, each one whispering memories I could no longer reach. When I arrived, the gate was still locked, still mocking me. But as I stood there, staring through the metal bars, an idea took root. One that started as a whisper but grew louder with every breath I took. They wanted to play games with ownership? Fine. I would play too, but on my terms. That night, I dug through my father's old filing cabinet in the garage. I found folders he had labeled in thick marker. Deeds, mineral rights, water access agreements. I stayed up reading every page, every clause, every scribbled note in the margins. That was when I saw it, buried in a legal document from 1973. A land split contract between my father and his old friend was a line that changed everything. Access to lakefront and adjoining roads shall remain permanently open to Parcel 3, regardless of future zoning or oversight. Parcel 3 was mine. My land. My key. I had what they thought I lacked: leverage. The next morning, I hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, someone who used to live here before the HOA forced him out over a garden gnome violation. He knew their playbook. We filed a petition to review the land rights, attaching every old record and document my father had saved. But I was not done. I had noticed something during my last visit to the HOA office, a small metal box behind the receptionist's desk. The access system. The one that controlled the gate locks for the entire lake perimeter. I did not need to hack it. I just needed to know who owned it. One call to the city registrar revealed the final crack in their wall. The land where the gate stood was still technically mine. They had built their empire on a mistake. Now I was going to use it to tear their kingdom down. 3 days later, a certified letter was hand-delivered to the HOA office. It was not a request. It was a legal notice, served with the full weight of property law and a precedent dating back 50 years. Inside, my lawyer laid out the facts with surgical precision. The HOA had illegally restricted access to private property. The gate stood on my land. The lake was part of a shared waterway under federal protection. And most importantly, the clause from 1973 rendered all their new boundaries meaningless. They had not just overstepped. They had built an empire on stolen ground. Mr. Thatcher called the next morning. His voice no longer carried that confident edge. "Mr. Lane, we believe there has been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we can arrange a meeting." I smiled as I stood on the porch of my father's home, staring at the gate that once shut me out. "There is no misunderstanding," I said. "There is only correction." But I was not here for a meeting. I was done talking. That afternoon, I brought a locksmith. With the papers in hand and the law on my side, I stood beside the gate as the metal chain was clipped. The HOA security guard arrived mid-job, red-faced and barking threats, but I calmly handed him a copy of the notice. "You were trespassing," I said. "This gate sits on my property. That makes this lock mine." The moment the chain hit the dirt, I felt something crack open inside me. It was not just about the gate anymore. It was about everything they had taken, not just from me, but from everyone they silenced. I stepped through and walked down the gravel path, the breeze coming off the lake warm on my face. The dock was still there, weathered but strong. Just like my father. Just like his promise, "This land is yours. Never let anyone take it." And I hadn't. I had taken it back. But this was only the beginning. News travels fast in a small town, especially when the HOA is involved. By the next morning, whispers had turned into phone calls, and phone calls turned into knocks on my door. First came an elderly couple from 3 houses down. Then a young mother with 2 kids. Then a retired Marine with a limp and a folder thicker than mine. One by one, they told me the same story. Fines, threats, locked amenities, forced compliance. Some had lost gardens they had tended for decades. Others were banned from using the community pool. One woman cried while explaining how she was fined for parking her dying mother's medical van on her own driveway for more than 72 hours. They were not lazy. They were not reckless. They were tired. Tired of being punished for living. And now, for the first time, they saw a crack in the wall. A man who had stood up and won. Suddenly, my fight was no longer mine alone. It had become ours. I turned my dining room into a war room. Maps, legal documents, photos, letters, timelines. We started compiling stories, cross-checking clauses, pulling HOA bylaws line by line. And that was when we found it. A hidden clause in the HOA charter that stated, "Any resident may challenge the board's authority through a majority petition if evidence of abuse is presented." No one had ever tried it, because no one ever believed it was possible. Until now. We needed signatures. Evidence. A movement. So we got to work, flyers, neighborhood meetings, old-fashioned door-to-door conversations. Some people were hesitant at first, afraid of retaliation. But the more we spoke, the more the truth sank in. The HOA was not a protector. It was a predator. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, unified, angry, but hopeful. We were not asking for chaos. We were asking for fairness, for dignity, for the right to live without being watched, fined, or locked out of our own lives. And slowly, we started collecting power, one signature at a time. 2 weeks later, we had 72 signatures, enough to trigger a mandatory HOA hearing under their own charter. We submitted the petition with a cover letter titled simply, "We want our neighborhood back." the board tried to stall it. They claimed some of the signatures were invalid because of minor formatting errors. But we had legal backup now, and they knew it. The date was set. The room was booked. The war was officially public. On the night of the hearing, the community center was packed. People stood against the walls, arms folded, faces firm. There were veterans in caps, moms with strollers, seniors holding decades of pain in their posture. And then there was Mr. Thatcher, seated at the center of the long table, his smile more forced than ever before, flanked by board members who suddenly looked less like rulers and more like strangers caught in the light. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I told them about my father's dock, about being locked out of my own family's lake, about the gate they built on land that did not belong to them. Then I handed them copies of documents, photos, names, dates, pages and pages of neighbor complaints that were ignored, manipulated, or punished. And then I read a letter written by a veteran in our community who could not be there that night because he had lost both legs in service and was recovering from surgery. I did not fight for freedom abroad just to be told I cannot fly a flag at home. That room went quiet. Even Mr. Thatcher stopped flipping his pen. Then something happened that none of us expected. The woman who once answered my call so coldly stood up. She looked at the board, then at the room, then back at the board. And she said, "We were wrong. This is not what community means." You could feel the energy shift, as if a weight had been lifted, or at least moved just enough to breathe again. But the board had not given up yet. They were still planning something, and I could see it in their eyes. They were scared, not of the crowd, but of losing control. They had run this neighborhood like a kingdom for too long. Now, the people were taking it back, piece by piece. 3 days after the hearing, retaliation began. Not through words, but through paper. Mysterious code violations started showing up on people's doors. Citations for overgrown grass by half an inch. Warnings for mailbox colors that had been there for 20 years. A single mom received a $1,200 fine for having her kid's bicycle on the lawn overnight. It was not discipline. It was intimidation. And I was not spared. A notice was taped to my father's door. Unauthorized alterations to property, subject to review. They accused me of tampering with the gate that I now legally owned. They even scheduled a compliance inspection. But they were not coming to inspect. They were coming to break me. I called a town reporter, someone who had covered HOA abuses in nearby counties. I handed her everything, the documents, the retaliation notices, the hearing video, the signatures, the illegal lockout. She spent 2 hours at my kitchen table, eyes wide the whole time. This, she said, is not just a story. This is a scandal. The next week, her article hit the front page, "When Home Becomes a Prison, Inside the Tyranny of Willow Creek HOA." It exploded. Local TV picked it up, then a regional outlet. Emails poured in from across the country, people sharing their own HOA nightmares, thanking us for standing up, offering help, even legal aid. Our small town became a spotlight for a much bigger issue. And suddenly, Mr. Thatcher and his board could not hide behind paperwork anymore. They called an emergency meeting, trying to spin the narrative. Said we were unruly, anti-order, chaotic. But no one was listening to them anymore. The power they had gripped for so long was slipping, and fast. And they knew it. That was when they did the unthinkable. They filed a lawsuit against me, claiming defamation, property damage, and inciting public disorder. But this time, they were the ones standing on the wrong side of the gate. The court date arrived faster than expected. I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer beside me, a folder under his arm, and calm in his stride. The room was quiet but tense, like everyone was holding their breath. Mr. Thatcher sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by 2 HOA attorneys in dark suits who looked like they had never stepped foot in the neighborhood they were defending. His face was tight, pale, and full of the kind of arrogance that comes right before a fall. The judge, an older black woman with a gaze that could cut through lies, entered the courtroom. She reviewed the filings, glanced at the evidence, and asked one question. "You were suing the defendant for defamation and damage on property that legally belongs to him?" One of the HOA lawyers stood. "Your Honor, the situation is more complex than..." She held up a hand. "Do you have proof that the gate was on your land?" Silence. "Do you have documentation that he altered anything outside of his legal right?" More silence. She looked at me. "Mr. Lane, do you have your title and survey with you?" I nodded and handed it over. She scanned it, then turned back to the plaintiffs. "This case should not have reached my bench. Her gavel hit the wood. Case dismissed. Full rights restored to the defendant. And I suggest this board reconsider its position before someone else brings a class action lawsuit. The room did not erupt in cheers, but the silence said more. It was not just a legal win. It was a moral one. The look on Mr. Thatcher's face said everything. He had lost control, and not just of the gate or the lake. He had lost control of the story. We walked out into the sunlight where a small crowd waited quietly. Someone handed me a coffee. An elderly woman patted my shoulder. The retired Marine gave a sharp nod, not in celebration, but in respect. This was no longer about a dock or a gate. It was about who gets to say what freedom looks like in your own home. But I had a feeling the HOA was not done yet. Because when power loses its grip, it claws. 2 nights after the court ruling, I received an anonymous envelope shoved under my door. No name, no return address, just a thick stack of photocopied pages, each marked with red pen and yellow highlighter. At first, I thought it was another threat, but as I flipped through it, my heart started pounding. It was an internal HOA audit report. Confidential. Never meant to be seen. And on page 4, buried in legal jargon and codes, was a list of properties. And a line that made my stomach twist. Parcel 3, acquired via quiet title transfer. No resident notification required. Parcel 3 was my land. They had tried to take it in secret. Quiet title transfers are legal tools used to resolve ownership disputes, usually for abandoned properties. But my land had never been abandoned. I had paid taxes every year. The HOA had filed it during a window when my father passed and the estate was in limbo. They filed it fast, quietly, and had marked the property as inactive even while I was still processing the will. They knew. They knew I owned it, and they tried to erase me. The report also listed line items showing where HOA fees were being funneled. Tens of thousands spent on landscape consultants that never showed up. Overpriced contracts awarded to companies with board members' relatives on payroll. And perhaps most disturbing, a record of undocumented surveillance equipment installed around the lake perimeter for security. They were watching people. This was no longer about boundaries. This was about abuse, control, corruption. I handed the file to the same reporter who had broken the first story. Within hours, she was on the phone with a national news network. And that was the moment the story exploded nationwide. My small town's war with its HOA became a symbol, a firecracker in a system built on quiet fear. But the truth was out now, and no gate could keep it in. By the end of that week, lawn signs started popping up around Willow Creek. HOA free zone, my home, my rules. We remember what you tried to erase. The people were done whispering. They were done hiding. The fear that had once hung over the neighborhood like thick fog was now replaced with something louder, defiance. For the first time in years, neighbors were organizing openly. They held town potlucks in driveways, built small libraries by the sidewalks, repainted their mailboxes in wild colors as acts of quiet rebellion. And then the petitions started again. But this time, it was not just to challenge the board. It was to dissolve the HOA completely. It had never been done in our county. It was considered nearly impossible. But impossible is just a word people use when they want you to stay small. We gathered signatures faster than anyone expected. Every story we shared fueled another signature. Every exposed lie brought more people to our side. Meanwhile, Mr. Thatcher tried to salvage what he could. He sent out newsletters filled with vague warnings about chaos and property value destruction. He even tried to call a private meeting for loyal residents. Only 3 people showed up. The spell had been broken. On the night of the final vote, the community center was full again. But this time, the mood was electric. Children played in the aisles. Laughter echoed. No fear. Just people, neighbors, ready to take back their lives. A simple count. Yes or no. Keep or dissolve. The final tally? 89% voted to dismantle the HOA. Just like that, the institution that had ruled over people's lives for decades crumbled. The documents were shredded. The signs came down. The gates were left wide open. And no one looked back. But this victory was not just for us. It was for everyone who had ever been bullied behind a fence, fined for being different, or locked out of something they already owned. We had not just won a vote. We had reclaimed freedom, house by house, neighbor by neighbor. And me? I walked down to the dock at sunset. The same dock my father built. I dipped my feet in the water and whispered, "I kept your promise, Dad." The weeks that followed felt like breathing for the first time in years. The fences came down. The cameras were removed. And with each small act of freedom, something started to return: trust. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact were now planting flowers together, helping each other paint, sharing tools, watching each other's kids. You could feel the community healing, slowly stitching itself back together. But it was not perfect. Some people still looked over their shoulders, half expecting a warning letter in the mail. A few former board loyalists walked around bitter, muttering about anarchy and falling standards. And even I found myself flinching when a city vehicle drove past, my body still wired for conflict. Freedom, it turns out, comes with scars. One afternoon, as I was fixing a plank on the dock, a man approached. He was in his late 60s, neatly dressed, holding a manila folder. "You do not know me," he said, "but I used to serve on the very first HOA committee, back when it was meant to protect, not control." He opened the folder and handed me a photo. It was of him and my father, standing by the lake, smiling, sleeves rolled up, holding shovels. "Your dad believed this place belonged to everyone who respected it. He said rules should serve people, not silence them." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He left quietly, but the photo stayed with me. I hung it in my hallway, right above the old deed, the one with parcel 3 still circled in red ink. Because this story, with all its battles and noise, was never just about the HOA. It was about memory, about dignity, about the idea that no gate, no fine, no letter can take away what is rightfully yours if you are willing to stand up and take it back. But something still felt unfinished. I had reclaimed my home, helped restore my neighborhood. Now it was time to make sure this never happened again. 2 months later, I stood before a different kind of crowd. This time, I was not fighting a gate, I was opening a door. The town council had invited me to speak after the Willow Creek case sparked similar movements across the state. In nearby neighborhoods, HOAs were being audited, residents were demanding transparency, and a wave of reform had begun rolling through communities that once lived under silence. I stepped up to the podium with no script, no legal folder. Just a voice and a truth. I did not set out to be a symbol, I began. I just wanted to walk to my lake, to sit on my father's dock, to live in peace. But what I found was not just a locked gate. It was a warning to all of us. That if we let control replace community, if we let fear rewrite freedom, then we lose more than rights. We lose each other. The room was silent. Not tense. Just listening. So now, I am working with a few good folks here, former residents, lawyers, teachers, veterans, to build something new. A group that helps neighborhoods reclaim their power. No fees. No threats. Just knowledge. Support. A place to stand. We called it Home First, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting homeowners from abuse of power. Not just legally, but emotionally. To remind people that home is not defined by policy, but by heart. And slowly, people began to join. Not out of anger, but out of hope. I went back to my lake that evening, just as the sun dipped below the trees. The wind was soft. The water calm. A new neighbor waved from across the dock, her dog barking joyfully at the water. Kids laughed down the path where fences used to stand. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, not vengeance, but peace. Because I had bought the key, but we had unlocked the future.